Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Glory to Jesus Christ. Whoever loses his life will gain his life. This is, again, one of my favorite gospel proclamations on Sunday of the Cross when we read out the Gospel of Mark. Because this feast, it's not always on the Sunday following, or rather the Annunciation doesn't always fall on the Friday before. But they're usually very much in connection to each other, in close proximity. Because the Feast of the Annunciation will fall on any numbered day of the week, depending on when the 25th of March falls. But this Sunday in Lent is always the Sunday of the Cross. So they're always in proximity to each other somehow. Sometimes it's wider, sometimes it's right next to each other. We had the Feast of the Annunciation on Friday, and we very much talked about yielding one's will to God's will. And the Feast of the Annunciation being that very feast where we see that the Mother of God has yielded her will in a perfect sense. Undoing the curse of Eve, she yielded her own will rather than asserting her own pride. And therefore taught us how to do that. We talked about how that was an image of the cross. The perfect image of humility. What is humility? What is that perfect image? It is completely emptying ourselves of ourselves so that the Lord's will may be done. Our will is put aside and the Lord's will is what is asserted. And the Mother of God showed us this very thing in the Annunciation from Gabriel to the Mother of God, telling her she was going to bear the Son of God. She could have said no. On the heels of that feast, we have the Feast of the Cross itself. The very beginning of all things is the cross. Humility. And in the Gospel today, Christ says, "He who wishes to come after me must take up his cross and follow me." Now this is prior to his own crucifixion. What could they have thought he was talking about? What do you mean, take up our cross and follow you? You're still with us. And I mean, most people didn't have this image in their head like, oh, he's going to go before Pilate. He's going to undergo the scourgings and the mockings and the spitting and what have you, and drag his cross through the streets and then ultimately be crucified, nailed to it even. Most people didn't really understand that was what was going on. So what could they have possibly have thought he was talking about when he was speaking to them? He who wishes to come after me must take up his cross and follow me. That must have been very puzzling. Surely they would have been familiar with that form of punishment, capital punishment, reserved by Caesar for only the worst of them. Common criminals were often crucified, and usually it was there to be an example of Roman justice, and that's what kept the peace. They would have been familiar with this gruesome practice of crucifixion. But still they didn't know that Christ was going to give up his very life and show us this perfect example of the cross, of yielding of the wills. What could they have even made of that statement? He who wishes to come after me must take up his cross and follow me. What could they have made of that statement unless it was for this purpose? They were not the only hearers of these words. We are present when these words are pronounced, when these words are proclaimed. We are present when they were spoken. We are present when they were spoken. Hey, that's the wrong tense. That's mixing of the tenses. We are present when those words were spoken. Because those words are spoken to you and me as well as to the people who were listening to Christ in Mark's Gospel. If you wish to have life, you must be willing to die. If you wish to gain heaven, you must be willing to yield the world. You can't have both. You cannot have both. This image of gruesome torture and punishment has become the very symbol of our victory, because it is the very way by which we gain heaven. This is the image of humility. This is the image of holiness. They are the same concept. Holiness and humility. They're one and the same. Love and submission are one and the same. How do we love Christ? By loving others. How do we... Husbands love their wives? It says, wives, submit to your husbands, Paul says. Husbands, love your wives. And we talked about how that sometimes is very much misinterpreted. And, oh, well, he only has to love me, why do I have to submit to him? Paul is saying the very same thing. To truly love, you must submit. He's saying to the wives the same things that he's saying to the husband, and to the husband the same thing he's saying to the wives. Wives, submit to your husband. Husband, love your wife. He's calling on the very pivotal part of true relationship. How do we truly love one another? By submitting and yielding to each other, yielding our will. How do we truly love Christ? By yielding. Our relationships are meant to mirror the cross. If we are truly in relationship to one another, then we are truly in relationship to Christ. How do we take up our cross and follow Him? How do we truly embrace humility and holiness? By yielding our will to His. And allowing His will to be done. The Mother of God said in the Annunciation, "Be it done unto me according to thy will." She could have said no. The Lord said, with Adam and his free will, He said to him, "Don't eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil." And through the guile of the serpent, Eve takes a bite, and as does Adam, introducing pride and sin and death into the world. This very yielding of the will by the Mother of God to the angel who said, "Hey, Mary, you're going to have a baby. Isn't that great? Hail Mary." She could have, and maybe arguably should have, said no. That's a big ask. But she said, "Let it be done unto me according to thy will." She reversed the curse of Eve in that very breath. The Feast of the Cross falls in the middle of Lent. This is the very midpoint. Can you believe it? It doesn't seem like we've even hardly started Lent. But here we are at the midpoint. And the Feast of the Cross falls at the midpoint on purpose. We have what you might call a dramatic costume change from purple to blue to red in most cases. The cross, of course, we wear red vestments and adorn the church with red paraments. We are brought to these moments in the middle time. The change of color, it's for our senses. It causes us to notice something is different. The change of the color says, pay attention. The cross is in the middle of Great Lent on purpose, so that we may be interrupted by something very beautiful and encouraged by it. Not discouraged. You might see, oh, the Feast of the Cross, that's gruesome, and it reminds me of Holy Week and all of the events recorded in the Gospels where Christ suffered, etc. And yes, it does, in a way. But it's meant to be there right in the middle of Lent as a form of encouragement. It's right there in the middle to show you why we're doing any of this. The icon of the angel visiting Mary is in the middle of the iconostas, with all of the images of our salvation around it. In a proper iconostas, you'll have several tiers. If it's big enough, it'll have Christ, the Mother of God, John the Baptist, the patron saint of the church. On the other side, it'll have the apostles, and then if you've got room, it'll have the great feasts, and more and more and more if you have the room. And right in the middle of all that, and that's the picture of our salvation. And right in the middle of which is the icon on the doors of the angel appearing to the Mother of God, and her saying, "Let it be done unto me according to thy will." That's in the middle of our visual scheme that's offered to us as we walk into the church, because we're meant to see what everything that surrounds it is that moment where the will is yielded. This falls in the middle of Lent as an image of voluntary sacrifice and a yielding of everything for the sake of the other, so that we may know why we do what we do. so that we may experience an image of the cross being everything. We may perceive that everything began on the cross. Even before the Lord said, "Let us make man in our image," the cross came first. Time is only relevant in a human context. We're the ones who are lashed to linear time. The cross is everything. This moment, or you could say these 3 hours. It took 3 hours for him to die, of course. The cross is where everything began. Before the universe ever was created, the cross happened. This is the beginning of everything in all directions. This falls in the middle of our Lenten striving so that we may see the cross in every direction as the image that the Lord needs us to have in our hearts and in our minds of how to love Him, of how to follow Him. He who wishes to come after me must take up his cross and follow me. He who wishes to be like me must do as I do, must sacrifice as I sacrifice, must yield as I have yielded. You cannot gain heaven any other way. This is in the middle of Lent so that we know what we've got ourselves into. And remember, the way to heaven, it is through the cross. It is through submission. It is through humility, holiness, and love. What is love but submission? We love Christ through loving others. We enter heaven through love, through humility, through sacrifice. It's the cross, my brothers and sisters. My children, this is the cross, and this is the way to heaven. And we have to yield ourselves, our will to God here. Always. We might profit from thinking about our day and wondering at the end of the day, how much of my day and myself have I yielded to God and to others today? Or have I lived only for myself and attempted to gain the world that will not save me? It says at the end of that gospel, some will not even taste of death until they see me coming in my glory. Some may have gone to great lengths to gain everything and gained everything that the world has to offer. And still they will die because they haven't lived. They haven't chosen life. They haven't chosen to submit their will to God's will and to submit to one another, to yield themselves to each other. Some will not taste death until they see Christ come again. They will see the source of life and they will have rejected it. Let us not be that person, those people. We want to be people of the cross. We want to be people who embrace the cross, who bow down before it and glorify. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory to Jesus Christ.